I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and let's kick this thing off. Again, we're going to start out with what I call the 30,000-foot presentation before we start delving into some technical sessions, which are going to go ahead and talk about jurisdictional authorities, responsibilities, as well as our policies and procedures in much, much greater detail. So first things first, let's go ahead and talk about our agenda for the next couple of days. Hey, Brian, is there any way there's an unmute your mic alert that's on the top of the agenda? Is there any way you could go ahead and look? Thanks, appreciate it. Okay, first things first, our agenda for the next couple of days. All right, we're going to kick off with a look at a few key messages and points we'd like you to take away from the time that we're going to be spending together, particularly regarding our permitting process. We'll then proceed to kind of a broad overview of the Coast Guard Bridge Program, including our roles and responsibilities, followed up by a walkthrough of how we go about processing a request for a bridge permit. Many of our procedural requirements are included in our Bridge Permit Application Guide, which we will talk about in further depth. We'll also hit on what the Coast Guard considers to be a complete, air quotes, application for a bridge permit, in addition to NEPA documentation we're going to be looking for, as well as navigational requirements and plan sheets, along with a brief discussion about design build and how that plays into the permitting process. Of course, our relationship does not end there when you have your bridge permit in hand, so we'll cover post-permit coordination along with a brief discussion about bridge lighting. All right, so by then I'm sure you'll all be dying for break and coffee, so take a quick 10 minutes. And after that, we're going to shift into our far more detailed technical sessions. And as you can see on your screen, we'll be drilling down to navigation impact reports, followed up by a deep dive into the particulars of the bridge permit application itself. We'll wrap up today with a Q&A, and then we'll start again tomorrow morning with an in-depth discussion regarding what we're looking for when it comes to plan sheets associated with a permit request. We were going to have FHWA dial in to give us a little bit of a primer on the Pell process, planning environmental linkages. Unfortunately, they won't be able to make it, but our presenter tomorrow, we do have the slide deck from FHWA, so he's going to incorporate that into his presentation and just give a brief intro about it. And if anybody from FHWA tomorrow has more Pell stuff that you'd like to go and contribute, that'd be great. Yeah, and then we'll have discussion regarding project timeline development, coordination with interagency partners, as well as dependencies, another air quote, dependencies. That's a word you're going to become very familiar with over the course of these presentations. I'll give you a brief primer on what I do as the Coast Guard liaison to FHWA, along with a discussion on certain permit exemptions, including 144C and advance approval. And then we'll finally wrap up with a Q&A session that can be pretty free form. And we're going to be looking to get some feedback from you guys in the audience about any previous experience you may have had when it comes to dealing with the Coast Guard. All right, so now that we've got the preliminaries knocked out of the way, let's dig into this thing. All right, so what are some of the big ticket items we'd like you folks to remember from what we discussed today and tomorrow? First, if you're looking at a project that involves a bridge, check with your local district bridge office to determine if you're going to need a permit. Don't take anything for granted. You may be dealing with a waterway that's far inland and may not appear to be navigable, but looks can be deceiving. It may very well prove to be navigable, but you want to go ahead and let the Coast Guard figure that one out for you. Put the monkey on their back. Set up a meeting with the local Coast Guard District Bridge Office. In this case, you guys will be dealing with our 7th Coast Guard District down in Miami early in the process, so you can get some solid clarification on our, yes? Yes, 8 as well. Portions of the state do yeah, down in New Orleans, but primarily you're going to be dealing mostly with D7 down in Miami. So they'll be able to go ahead and give you solid clarification on our application process and requirements. It's also helpful to get to know these folks because they'll be intimately involved right from the start. It's good to be able to match faces to names, and that applies to us as well. On our public website, we've uploaded our Bridge Permit Application Guide. which literally walks you through the permit process step by step, along with an application template and a checklist for plan sheets. Use it and abuse it, please. If you have any questions, then by all means, reach out to us and we can address your concerns. All right, we've also found that it's helpful to get a project timeline going. This will facilitate communications not only with the Coast Guard, but other permitting agencies as well, allowing everybody to see the big picture and get an accurate idea as to where the project stands. The project officer from the District Bridge Office assigned to shepherd your project through the permitting process will be able to help you with this. Now, keep in mind that your project may, the important word here is may, require the preparation of a navigation impact report, which should describe the variety of vessel traffic using the waterway within the vicinity of the bridge project in question, and what sort of navigational clearances will be required in order for these same vessels to safely proceed through the opening of the proposed bridge. This should be done either prior to or in the beginning stages of your NEPA analysis, because the information gleaned from the navigation impact report will inform our preliminary navigation clearance determination, which will in turn inform the various alternative designs the Coast Guard will find acceptable. Above all, talk. Check in with us frequently. I promise we'll be fine with repeated emails and phone calls. I tend to look at it this way. The more issues we can address on the front end, the fewer headaches we'll be dealing with on the back end. But robust communication is the key to that. All right, so now that we've talked about some of the big points we're looking to drive home, let's move on. Big picture time. Yeah.
Will these slides be available after your presentation?
They will be. Actually, this presentation is being recorded by GDOT.
Okay.
So, yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And also, yeah, one other thing, we tend to try to keep these presentations kind of free form, and I wouldn't necessarily say freewheeling, but we're not going to say defer all your questions to the end. If you've got something you want to chat about, by all means, interrupt. You know, it's just, yeah, we like to go ahead and keep it more of a discussion format than anything else. And again, the big picture. First off, how is the Coast Guard organized? The Coast Guard is geographically divided into two distinct areas, the Atlantic area and the Pacific area. Both of these areas have 9 subordinate district commands. Atlantic area is comprised of 5 districts, while Pacific area has the remaining 4. Of note, our 8th district is a little unusual. Given its sheer size, that has been subdivided into 2 separate district bridge offices, one in New Orleans and the other one's in St. Louis. And if you take a look at the insert on the lower right-hand corner, you can see the dividing line for the 8th district, which is huge. All right, the Coast Guard Bridge program itself employs somewhere in the neighborhood of 53 staff. That's not a lot of people performing a pretty important job if you think about it. I happen to work at Coast Guard headquarters in DC, and our primary responsibility there is to provide programmatic guidance to field staff. That said, we also have our fingers in the permitting process. Any permit requiring either an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement will ultimately be signed and issued at our level. And the workhorse of the Coast Guard Bridge program, of course, is the District Bridge Office, wherein the bulk of the day-to-day work when it comes to permits and regulatory matters is performed. Those are the guys you're going to be dealing with, and those are the guys you need to get to know. You're going to be coordinating with them if you're looking for a bridge permit or seeking to modify an operating regulation for a movable bridge. In this case, more often than not, you're going to be dealing with the 7th Coast Guard District, which is, again, is located down in Miami. All right, so that's a geographic snapshot. All right, your roles and responsibilities. Let me bore you with some legal mumbo jumbo. All right. Cottonmouth is a thing. The bridge program has jurisdiction over more than 20,000 bridges across navigable waters as established by the following acts. The Bridge Act of 1894, Section 9 of the Rivers and Harbors Appropriations Act, March 3rd, 1899, the Act of March 23rd, 1906, the General Bridge Act of 1946, and the International Bridge Act of 1972. Right? And then there's 33 CFR Part 2.36. Told you all before, if you're going to build a bridge, it's a good idea to reach out to the Coast Guard to determine if the waterway you're looking to build across is considered to be navigable. The Coast Guard, in accordance with this passage, considers navigable waters to include the territorial seas of the United States, internal waters of the United States subject to tidal influence, and or non-tidal waters that have or could be used as highways for interstate or foreign commerce, or could be improved to do so at a reasonable cost. Trucking along now, let's just talk a little bit more about our roles and responsibilities, and then we can move on. The Coast Guard Bridge Program lives and breathes by our bottom line that a bridge crossing any navigable water of the United States shall not obstruct the reasonable needs of navigation during any part of the life cycle of that same bridge, including rehabilitation, repair, maintenance, and construction. The Coast Guard monitors bridges to ensure bridge lighting, temporary structures, clearance gauges, and bridge protective systems are also in compliance with applicable federal laws and policies. The Coast Guard is also responsible for permitting bridges, prescribing drawbridge operating schedules, and managing the alteration of unreasonably obstructed bridges. We're going to be pretty much focusing, though, on the permitting angle for the next couple days. And that leads us into the when, where, why, and how that underlines the process by which the Coast Guard actually issues a permit for a bridge to be built. So buckle up. The good part starts now. And here we have what most applicants hope to see when they approach the Coast Guard for a bridge they'd like to build. A Coast Guard bridge permit is the official authorization to construct or modify a bridge that crosses a navigable waterway. Any individual, partnership, corporation, or local, state, or federal legislative body planning to construct or modify a bridge must apply for a bridge permit. This includes all temporary bridges used for construction access or as a means to detour traffic around the construction zone. So if you're building a new bridge and you're looking to go ahead and use a temp bridge, Coast Guard has to authorize that as well in our permit. Now, breathe easy. Most bridge repair jobs are not, repeat, not going to require permit action on the part of the Coast Guard. But that doesn't necessarily hold true if the proposed repair will impact the previously approved navigation clearances or the configuration of the bridge, in which case you may be staring down a permit amendment. So just food for thought there. All right, so what do we expect from you if you're looking for a bridge permit? First things first, grab a hold of us, start a conversation. Give us a good idea of what you're proposing, and that will allow us to look at the waterway and determine if you even need a permit to proceed. Second, presuming you're going to need a permit, ask the Coast Guard project manager assigned to shepherd your endeavor through the process to literally walk you through the bridge permit application guide. If this thing you want to build will require a permit after all, you'll need to gin up a project initiation request, which is discussed in further detail in the BPAG. Once we have that, we're off to the races. All right, your friendly Coast Guard project manager will let you know if you need to prepare a navigation impact report. This should be done early in the process. A lot of people say it can be done concurrent with NEPA scoping. My personal take on it, I think it should be done prior to NEPA scoping. If that's the case, he or she will work with you and let you know what we're going to be looking for in the navigation impact report. We'll use the data gleaned from the NIR to inform our preparation of the preliminary navigation clearance determination. The PNCD is important insofar as it will definitively state the minimum horizontal and vertical clearances the Coast Guard will tolerate so as to not impede maritime traffic utilizing the waterway. The PNCD should be used in order to inform NEPA alternatives when you're looking to nail down your preferred alternative. And of course, there is always more. When you feel you've accumulated enough information to do so, it'll be time to send a bridge permit application our way. A couple caveats. We're going to consider this to be the initial application, which may not necessarily have everything we need to issue a permit, but it'll have enough meat on the conceptual bones that we can at least get the process started. We'll review the permit application, and within 30 days or so, you'll get a letter from us noting one of two things. Either that is complete or incomplete. More often than not, particularly this early in the process, we're going to tell you that it's incomplete. But we'll also furnish details regarding what pieces happen to be missing. Some of this stuff you likely won't be able to nail down until much later in the process anyway. For example, the water quality certification. That doesn't mean the process stops, of course. Things will keep trucking along as you gather additional items necessary to plug holes and keep forward momentum going. Now, once we've got enough data on hand, we can proceed to issuing a public notice. The public notice is what it says it is. It's a notification that will allow the public at large the opportunity to sort of digest what's being proposed and to furnish feedback to the Coast Guard, all of which is taken into consideration when it comes time to render a permit decision. Generally, most comment periods run for about 30 days. We'll generally want, by this stage of the game, to know what level of environmental review we're looking at, as well as the lead federal agency. We'll also want to know that a water quality certification has at least been applied for. If the Coast Guard isn't the lead federal agency, then we'll be primarily interested in the effects the proposed bridge may have on waterway navigation, and we'll defer any comments of an environmental nature to the lead federal agency. If we're running the entire show, though, of course, we're going to be taking everything into account. All right, so let's talk some about the document that I've been ramming down your throats, not too subtly for a while now, the Bridge Permit Application Guide, or as we affectionately refer to it, the BPAG. All right, people who are much smarter than myself have had a hand in creating the BPAG, which was designed from the ground up as a tool you can reference that kind of walks you through the bridge permit application process. We have that guide in addition to a word-based bridge permit application template on our public-facing website. All right, I'd gladly give you the address, but the URL is an absolute monstrosity. So instead, I've got a handy-dandy QR code. So if you guys would like to go ahead and scan that, be my guest. But well, we'll have the QR code on later slides. If you don't or can't use the QR code, no big deal. You can just Google Bridge Permit Application Guide, Coast Guard, and the URL will pop up on Google. But like I said, the URL itself is about a mile long. It's crazy. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Navigation Impact Report in some more detail. You're going to be getting a more in-depth review of what we'll be looking for in a Navigation Impact Report during the first technical presentation, which will be Jamie Schultzen who'll be presenting that. So regard this as sort of a snapshot. First things first, how this thing even become a thing? Well, it's required under the provisions of a Memorandum of Understanding between the Coast Guard and the Department of Transportation for those projects federally funded through DOT. Appendix A of the BPAG gives the reader a pretty good breakdown of what sort of data we're looking for in a solid navigation impact report. Important note here, it's on you guys, and I'm talking to the GDOT guys, to develop the navigation impact report. You can use a contractor if you'd like, but it's on you, actually the applicant as well. If you run into a roadblock or you have questions about it, then by all means reach out to us, but you'll be the folks who'll be writing the thing. Kind of oversimplified, the Navigation Impact Report should document not only historic and present waterway usage up and downstream of the site of proposed construction, but projected usage as well, which, yes, that can be tricky sometimes. That means talking to metropolitan planning organizations or any other entities who may have designs on certain portions of the waterfront and what they visualize in terms of future development. All that stuff must be taken into consideration. Again, the bottom line is that we're looking for assurance that the proposed bridge will not unreasonably obstruct waterway navigation. The sooner we can get this thing in hand, the better. Your navigation impact report will inform our preliminary navigation clearance determination, which in turn will inform your selection of a preferred alternative during NEPA scoping. Bit of good news though. There are those times when a navigation impact report will not be required. The Coast Guard may already have plenty of waterway usage data on hand if we've been dealing with another or even multiple projects on the same waterway. Or we may be looking at a modification or replacement that does not alter the clearances already offered. Bottom line though, it'll be the project manager at the district bridge office who will determine if you need to generate a navigation impact report. So again, the earlier you get that discussion started, the better. You've heard me talk about it before, so here we go. The preliminary navigation clearance determination. Once we've had an opportunity to digest the navigation impact report, we'll then start work on generating the PNCD. The PNCD will define the minimum navigation clearances the Coast Guard will tolerate that do not unreasonably affect waterway navigation, and you guys will use that document in order to inform your NEPA alternatives. Important note, the PNCD remains valid for 3 years. After that point, it may be necessary to start the process once again. So that's something you may want to keep in mind if you're dealing with a complex project that has kind of a weird or unpredictable revenue stream. Another note, the final navigation clearance determination consists of the issued permit and the plan sheets that'll bear a Coast Guard approval stamp. Yes? Yeah, the microphone.
If it has been more than 3 years, do you have to start all over, or can you do a reevaluation?
The PNCD generally has a shelf life of 3 years. And what we'll do is when you get the permit, what we'll do is we'll give you time limits. We're going to give you 2 years, and this is, again, fairly broad-based, but our industry standard is you'll get 2 years in order to start construction, 5 years in order to wrap construction up. So if something were to happen to that timeline, it's a distinct possibility that you may have to go ahead and start the process again for the, in order to nail down another PNCD. And if you think that that's going to present an issue, again, it's better to go ahead and talk to the Coast Guard and try to resolve that on the front end rather than having to deal with it on the back end. And then, I'm certainly not going to promise, but we may be able to go ahead and work something out. But generally, yeah, we're looking at a 3-year timeline for a PNCD. Yep. All right. The bridge permit application itself. Again, we're going to be covering this in exhaustive detail in the bridge permit application technical session. You're going to need coffee for that. But painting with broad strokes, this is some of the preliminary information that we're going to require. Okay, and you can just see on the slide, this is just administrative stuff, really. The date of the application, applicant info, the agency, primary point of contact, street address, phone number, email address. If you're working with a consultant, we're going to need the consultant agency information. Names of the proposed bridge, or name. This one is important. settle on one name for the bridge. And it should be reflected not only in the permit application, but the plan sheets themselves. This is a thing. Tappan Zee Bridge. It's now the Mario Cuomo Bridge up in the Hudson River in New York. You know, nobody calls it the Mario Cuomo Bridge. It's the Tappan Zee Bridge. But still, and that's not an outlier. This happens a lot. So decide what you want to call the bridge and stick to it. I mean, it's a thing that we deal with, and it happens more often than, you know, we care to admit. But yeah, nail that down, and that'll be very, very helpful. Name of the waterway. This is another big one. Again, using New York as an example. Hudson River. There is not one tugboat driver in New York that calls the Hudson River. They call it the North River. So again, that's something to keep in mind. You know, again, there may be various aliases for a waterway. Select one name, and let's stick to it. Number of miles above the mouth of the waterway. That's going to be measured in statute miles, or as I heard, we gave a presentation at New York State DOT. They actually said roadway miles, which I actually think is a better description. But we're not using nautical miles. We want that measured in statute miles or roadway miles. And then city, town, county, and state where the bridge is going to be located. If it's going to be located between two towns, then state that. State, you know, it's between the town of Sunnyvale and whatever other place you've got. But try to give us at least a semi-accurate location, and then we'll go ahead and run with that. And of course, there's even more administrative stuff. So yeah, brief description of the project, including the type of bridge. Is it fixed? Is it movable? What are we looking at? Applicable drawbridge regulation, if any. So in other words, you're looking at converting a fixed bridge to a movable bridge, or you're going to be going ahead and getting rid of a movable bridge, changing it to fixed. Cite the drawbridge regulation. Date and number of plan sheets. Again, we're going to be drilling down to the plan sheets tomorrow morning, and that's going to be a big presentation. Project cost and source of funding. This is a big one. So we're going to want to know who the lead federal agency is, and also going to want to know what sort of mix of dollars that we're getting, federal, state, as well as local. Proposed construction timeline. Try to give us at least a good snapshot of what you're anticipating, with the understanding that, yeah, some of this stuff could be potentially a little bit fluid on down the line, but at least try to give us a pretty good conceptual basis that we can work with. Other federal actions, meaning other federal permits. Guaranteed, whatever you build, Army Corps is going to be in the mix. So we're going to be looking at a 404 permit, Section 10, and if it's federal navigation channel, 408 is going to rear its ugly head. So, yeah. Right to build. In other words, if you got a privately owned bridge, we're going to want to know about that. Propose any temporary dimensions, vertical and horizontal clearance, length overall, and the out-to-out width of the bridge itself. This is going to have to be noted not only in the permit application, but on the plan sheets. Again, we're going to be drilling into this in further detail today and tomorrow morning. If you're replacing a bridge, we're going to want to know the existing bridge info. Name, type, dimensions, and who actually owns the thing. And finally, construction methodology, maintenance of land traffic, extent of removal of the existing bridge. Are you going to be demolishing the entire thing in total, or are you going to be retaining certain portions for like fishing piers? That's information that we need to know, because then the Corps is going to be stepping in, and they'll be looking at, okay, then, you know, you're going to be retaining at least one abutment as a fishing pier, then that needs to be permitted as a structure in the water, vice a bridge. And demolition method. Again, you're going to be removing this thing, taking a barge up with a crane, or are you going to actually blow it up? We need to know all that stuff. Okay, so I've already thrown a lot of information at you, and yeah, the next couple of days, like I said, it's going to be drinking from a fire hose. So before we start drilling into the environmental stuff, anybody got any questions? All right. Hearing none, let's get this ball rolling. Issuance of a Coast Guard bridge permit is a federal action, and therefore, whether we like it or not, triggers NEPA. So, right from the get-go, we're going to need some information to proceed. First things first, what agency is driving the bus? If it's a highway bridge, more likely than not, we're looking at the Federal Highway Administration as the lead federal agency. Railroad bridge, probably FRA or FTA. Pedestrian bridge, who knows? Bottom line, some agency must be calling the shots. And guess what? If no federal funding is involved, but a bridge permit is still required, the Coast Guard, by default, will assume the role as the lead federal agency. Oh, shoot. Will assume the role as lead federal agency for NEPA review purposes, so lucky us. On top of identifying the lead federal agency, it's also a good idea to determine who the rest of the players are. It's always good to know who the cooperating agencies will be, because as the process moves along, we'll run into a little thing known as dependencies, and I used that word before. By way of gross oversimplification, a dependency occurs when a pending action by one agency is dependent upon another action taken by a cooperating agency. Whether we like it or not, this sort of kabuki dance is part and parcel of the picture, and it's important. Of course, it might be helpful to know what level of environmental review we're looking at. The more complex or large the project, the more important early engagement is, and it would be valuable to develop a coordinated project plan, or CPP, which we'll talk about in a bit. All right, so let's get a broad overview of some of the environmental control laws we're expected to adhere to no matter what, even if we're looking at a CADX. First off, Section 401 of the Clean Water Act comes into play, so you'll need to furnish us a water quality certification, a waiver, or some sort of confirmation that a water quality cert isn't necessary, which is pretty rare. Bottom line is this: no water quality certification, no permit. Also, just to make things even more complicated, if you've got a bridge project that spans a waterway cutting between two states, then we may need two separate water quality certifications. We do, however, deal with core nationwide permits. So, if you're going to go that route, make sure it covers the scope of the proposed project, including both the date as well as the type of NWP in your application. Which brings us to Section 404. Under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, if construction of the bridge is going to involve in-water work, by that I mean piers, pier protection systems, false work, etc., along with potential dredging or discharge of fill onto the waterway, then the applicant must obtain a permit from the Corps of Engineers. The Corps, at their discretion, may issue either an individual or a nationwide 404 permit for the project. Coastal Zone Management, yes, sir.
So before a bridge permit would be issued, any 404 or 401 would need to be in hand before you would issue the bridge permit, ultimately?
Yes.
Okay.
That's my answer. I'm sticking to it.
Yep.
All right, CZMA. And this could apply to you guys. If you're going to build your bridge within an area subject to the CZMA, then you have to consult with the state in order to nail down a consistency certification. And just out of curiosity, what's the agency in Georgia that would handle that? So I honestly don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, we have Coastal Resource Division, which is DNR.
So they would be the agency that would generate, or at least they know who would generate the consistency certificate? Okay. All right, ESA, Endangered Species Act. More often than not, any projects you have planned will likely intrude in some fashion into a critical habitat for a threatened species or somehow impacts a species protected under the Endangered Species Act. If that's the case, then you're going to need to furnish us documentation as noted in the slide with your permit application. Contingent on the type of species you happen to be talking about, you'll be dealing with either the National Marine Fisheries Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service, or both. If those guys concur that the bridge project isn't likely to adversely affect listed species, or that a species isn't likely present, then no further consultation will be necessary. The trick is documentation, documentation, documentation. Make sure all your bases are covered. A conversation that isn't documented never happened. Include that documentation as an enclosure to your bridge permit application. If protected resources might be present in the proposed project area, then you may be on the hook for a biological assessment. And yep, you'll need to include that BA with your permit application. Better yet, if the project is likely to pose an adverse impact to any threatened or protected species in the area of proposed construction, then it'll be time for some formal consultation with either NMFIS or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're going to have to generate a biological opinion. Again, talk to us and make sure that whatever documentation you have on hand is sent our way. Magnuson-Stevens. Long story short, if the bridge you're looking to build may affect a designated essential fish habitat, then we're going to need to review your list of impacted species, the EFH assessment, along with any discussions you've had with NMFIS, as well as proposed mitigation. If you have to gin up an assessment, then include a list of the impacted species, offer an analysis of the effects the bridge project can bear on the essential fish habitat, and summarize NMFIS's point of view regarding those same effects, as well as proposed mitigation. Now, NMFIS may very well lump EFH into their Endangered Species Act analysis, if for no other reason to be a little bit more efficient and save some space and paper. So just be ready for that as a possibility. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 requires federal agencies to take into account the effects of any undertaking on sites listed in the National Register of Historic Places. This includes submerged abandoned shipwrecks. One thing worth noting, 106 is not NEPA, but it is run concurrent with the process. The whole thing starts with the determination of the area of potential effect, followed by a sit-down with the State Historic Preservation Officer and, if necessary, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Again, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but document everything and communicate with us. If a programmatic agreement or an MOA comes out of the consultations, then we'll want to see that included as a part of your permit application. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, those are just a few examples of environmental control laws. These are just a few more that you'll have to discuss when you shoot us a permit application. Now, that comes with the understanding that some may not necessarily apply to your project, but if that's the case, you're going to need to note why in the application itself. So you'll have an option to say NA on a permit application, but we're going to want that NA justified. All right, let's talk plan sheets. Again, this is just a snapshot of requirements. I'm going to be digging into this in far greater detail tomorrow during our technical presentation. Need a drink of water.
Jim, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Can you go over the timeline a little bit more? So you said that there was a preliminary decision from the Coast Guard that was valid for 3 years. Going back to
No, it's not preliminary. It's a preliminary navigation clearance determination.
Gotcha.
Okay.
And then we were talking about different things that you guys want in that bridge application, and like the 404 permit's not going to be received until pretty close to the project going into construction. So could you sort of lay out like how the timeline works? Because a lot of those things that you said are in the bridge application take a while to get.
Generally, the Coast Guard bridge permit is going to be the final piece of the puzzle. That's going to be the final permit. And yeah, generally it's Corps and then finally the Coast Guard. So any other permit's going to be coming beforehand, and then finally you get the Corps permit, and then we will be following up the Corps very shortly thereafter. So that's the general sequence. As far as the timeline, how long it would take, we give ourselves, when we send you a letter that your permit application is considered to be complete, and like I said, when you send us the initial application, 9 times out of 10 we're going to say it's incomplete. And we've had some applicants pulling their hair out, like, oh, what do you mean? And it's like, no, don't take it personally, because we're still funneling you information. But when we say it's complete, then the Coast Guard's on the clock. At that point, we have 90 days to render a permit decision. That does not mean that it's going to take the complete 90 days. As long as you guys have been talking to us, you know, we've been talking to GDOT, you know, we've been talking to the consultants, we've been talking to all the other cooperating agencies. If we've had robust communication, then it could take considerably far less than 90 days. I don't want to say 10 days or something like that, but we give ourselves that 90-day window. But again, depending on the quality of communication, it would be a lot sooner than that.
Got a follow-up question to that, kind of building on that, just to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So you said that preliminary navigation clearance determination has a 3-year validity period. What milestone needs to be achieved within that 3-year validity period? Is that like a NEPA decision, or?
Well, again, when we issue the permit, we give you timelines. We say you've got 2 years to start construction and 5 years to complete construction. That's our industry standard. Now, could be modified. If you've got a particularly complex project, we've issued permits where we may say 3 and 7 or 3 and 6. So it just depends. But generally, 2 and 5 is our industry standard. So the PNCD is geared more towards construction. And if at that 3-year mark you haven't started construction, again, we give you 2 years to start construction, then at that point we may need to go ahead and reevaluate the PNCD, which could require the preparation of new navigation impact reports, because things along the waterway may have changed at that point. But again, you know, the trick is talk to your Coast Guard PM. All right, the more you're talking on the front end, you know, again, you know, I keep on hammering that, but it's the truth. I mean, the more communication and coordination that you got on the front end, the fewer headaches that you're going to be dealing with on the back end. And you try to minimize the number of surprises. I know that's impossible, but you at least try to minimize them. So, all right.
Hey, this is Jamie. The next presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about the NAV impact report, the evaluation, and the PNCD, and I touch on those topics coming up. So.
Yeah, and it's going to be great detail. You're going to get everything that you asked for and more. All right, so plan sheets. Coast Guard requirements for plan sheets may be found in 33 CFR 115.50. That's an exciting nighttime reading if you're ever looking to go to sleep. And now, let's make one thing very, very, very clear. These are not, repeat, not, NOT in capital letters, construction grade plan sheets we're looking for here. The plan sheets we want will serve as a physical description, or depiction rather, of the characteristics of the bridge approved under the auspices of the permit itself, namely the navigation clearances. Luckily for you, we provide a checklist on our website that you can use to make sure all of your bases are covered. Bottom line, follow that and you should be golden. That checklist, referred to as the Plan Sheet Job Aid, is available as a fillable template for download from our Bridge Program website. Your Coast Guard contact should also be able to provide you a copy. Basically, what you see there in the slide covers it. The bottom line to remember is that when you're generating plan sheets for the Coast Guard, try to gear it for Joe public, particularly because these plan sheets will go out with a public notice for the project. Just follow the template, keep in mind the KISS principle, and you'll be okay. And as Jamie said for her presentation, I'll be covering plan sheets tomorrow, so we're going to be going into far greater detail on this. All right, here's sort of an example of what we're looking for. This is an elevation view of a pedestrian bridge over the Bass River in Massachusetts, right by Cape Cod. This is a permit I wrote, incidentally, back in 2015. Anyway, it depicts the navigational clearances afforded mariners at mean high water, mean low water, as well as the 100-year flood elevation. We also require a few other items, such as noting the datum used, as well as a graphic bar scale. On a plan view, we'll want to see a north arrow. And of course, we've got the plan sheet stamped and signed by a professional engineer. Why do we want PEs stamping and signing these things if they're not construction grade? Well, they're smarter than at least me when it comes to math, and we need those clearances verified by someone who went to school for this stuff. We'll be digging in, and like I said, I put in some text there, but we're going to be digging deeper into this tomorrow. So we're going to talk about this in far greater detail. All right, so when is your application considered to be complete? We've talked about the bulk of this stuff already. So again, at the 30,000 foot level, but bottom line, when you submitted all the materials noted in this slide, you'll get a letter from your assigned project officer informing you that the permit application is complete and the Coast Guard, like I said before, is on the clock. That means that we should render a permit decision within 90 days. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll take the full 90. If the communication between the applicant and the Coast Guard has been robust from the get-go and potential snags have been headed off at the pass, then you could conceivably see the permit within an abbreviated timeline. And time to discuss the latest craze in the engineering universe, design build. This is something the Coast Guard is still wrapping its arms around. If you've got a project that's a design build candidate, then definitely start chatting up your assigned project manager at the district bridge office. We'll want to make sure that our permit and navigational clearance requirements are included in the RFP. They're going to have to be baked in from the start. The important thing to remember is that, yes, design build takes for granted that there may be design changes as the project progresses, but those navigational clearances are sacrosanct. I'm not kidding. You cannot mess with those. If you want to change, then you're going to need to talk to us. But far better to solve issues on the front end and take every eventuality into account. Now, we understand that the design concept you're going to send our way may only be at the 30 to 40% stage. We're fine with that. The idea is to lock in the navigation clearances for the RFP. If you need to generate a navigation impact report, and far better to get it done ASAP, way before you even start thinking about the RFP. Wait on our preliminary navigation clearance determination, and then we can go from there. Bottom line, keep the lines of communication open, ensure the Coast Guard is apprised, particularly if it appears as if the final design may impact the previously agreed upon navigation clearances. All right, what happens after you have your permit in hand? Got a couple late arrivals? Yeah.
So it's more of a question on the change aspect. Is the elevation like your key concern in general? Like I'm thinking a change, like if there's an aesthetic change or something not associated with over the waterway per se, would that be something that
aesthetic changes, we're not going to sweat the load too much.
Okay,
What we're primarily concerned about, particularly when we're looking at a design build, like I said, we want to make sure that those navigation clearances, e.g. the vertical and horizontal clearances, are baked in.
Okay.
So we take that for granted. Particularly, like I said, if you're getting a set of plan sheets at 30% stage, things are gonna change. But we want those navigation clearances baked in. And again, you know, it's like, you're gonna send us a final set of plan sheets when the thing's actually built. You know, we're gonna be looking for as-built. But that's primarily what we're interested in. From our jurisdictional perspective, we're interested in the navigation clearances. You want to put birds or butterflies on the, you know, we don't care. It's like, but yeah, we just want to make sure that navigation will be able to proceed through the opening. Okay, post-permit coordination. When you're building your new bridge, the Coast Guard will actively monitor your progress. If you need to temporarily restrict vessel movements in order to facilitate construction, then you're going to need to talk to the district bridge office, and then they'll coordinate with the applicable captain of the port. Our district staff also routinely publish local notice to mariners that advise waterway users of what's going on within their AOR when it comes to bridge construction, including the type of work, location, mile marker, dates of construction, and any waterway closures. Your contractors need to be talking to us routinely so we can keep everybody effectively in the loop. Bridge lights. We handle bridge lighting separately from actual bridge permits. Bottom line, the Coast Guard will determine if a bridge requires navigation lights in order to ensure the safety of mariners utilizing the waterway, as well as protecting the bridge itself. Bridge lighting schemes are not super complicated. As depicted in the photograph, red lights mark the edge of the navigation channel, green lights mark the center line. Nothing overly complex. You can find our standard lighting configurations for both fixed and movable bridges in 33 CFR Part 118, but we also have available for use a handy-dandy bridge lighting manual on our website, which I earlier gave you guys the QR code for. We may, on occasion, prescribe a special lighting configuration for a specific bridge that presents kind of an unusual circumstance, but that's pretty rare. Again, talk with the district bridge office and they'll get you pointed in the right direction. Finally, a word about decorative lighting. Okay, we get it. Decorative lighting makes bridges look pretty at night, but if you're going to go down that road, you have to talk to the Coast Guard in order to ensure that the lights you're going to rig do not interfere with or obstruct the visibility of the navigation lights from the perspective of the mariner trying to proceed safely underneath the bridge. All right, anybody got any questions before we head into our break? And just in case you missed the first time, there's a QR code. Yes, sir.
So GDOT has a robust state-funded program. So if it ended up a project became a state-funded, no federal dollars, and you become the lead, it's upon GDOT to complete the NEPA document, you know, on your behalf, in essence. I mean, you would be, assumed the signatory on it, but in that case, you know, would Coast Guard give GDOT the ability to complete the NEPA document, if that makes sense, like dealing with agencies and all that?
You're going to be handling the NEPA process. We're going to go ahead and we're at what, you know, if you have an EIS, we're going to be going ahead and reviewing the EIS. We're going to make sure that it's sufficient from our perspective. Again, we run everything through checklist. So we're going to make sure that the EIS covers all the applicable bases, and then we're going to go ahead and generate the record of decision for an EIS, FONSI for an EA. So,
right, but I'm talking about like consultations and all that that would feed into the NEPA document.
No, you're going to be, GDOT would be handling that. Right. We can be privy to those conversations. What we're looking for is documentation. We want to make sure that those conversations happened. And that's what we're looking for, document everything. Because again, we're going to generate a findings of fact. And the FOF, it is what it says it is. You know, we need to be able to cite every occurrence, every administrative thing that happened during the process to get from point A to point B to point C to the actual permit issuance. So we want to go ahead and we want to make sure that every part of the NEPA process has been nailed down, all the necessary consultations took place, and we have the letters to attest to that. If there's not a federal funding component, the Coast Guard would take the lead. If there's no federal funding component, if there, more often than not, and that, I don't want to say it happens rarely, but it does happen. But yeah, more often than not, FHWA gets the lion's share of our attention because again, we're dealing with highway projects, and if there are federal dollars involved, it's going to be FHWA. In which case, we're interested in it. We're going to go ahead and take a look at it. We're still going to double check it. But again, we're working hand in glove with FHWA on that.
Federal highway, you guys wouldn't get involved with state funding.
No, I think that you would have to have the conversation like with the Corps, and I think that.
No, I understand that.
Yeah, there's
I'm
probably
just
like.
saying, though, in general,
Yeah.
they're the lead.
Right.
You guys are void of involvement, even just in general.
State aid, we have
No,
no
no, I know.
action, no action,
Yeah.
no money, no action.
I
from us,
understand.
No prior approval for, like access, no action from us.
It's just on the reason why I asked the question, Forest Service has come back and said occasionally, like, oh no, any road project goes through federal highway, even if it's state aid. So there's like, that's why I'm just asking the
That may
question.
be federal land that you're dealing with, right? There's two.
No,
different, there are two different.
No, I understand what you're saying, but Forest Service on, it's
Yeah,
fine.
so within federal highway, there's a Fed lands, like, it's a sub-agency basically with us. So if there's a project on Forest Service land, Fed lands, it takes care of it. So,
Okay,
like,
I see what you mean.
yeah, like not like federal lands, like they're actually an agency, like Fed lands.
All right,
So,
I see what you're saying.
yeah, so there might be coordination with that.
Yes, sir.
So you had talked earlier about any waters that could potentially become navigable. Do you ever have situations, or how often, where it goes the other way, where it is navigable, but it's anticipated to become non-navigable, maybe realignment, gets too rough, dries up, how often does that happen?
Not too terribly often.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not saying that's impossible, but it doesn't happen too terribly often. Again, it's like the folks that you want to talk to, and, beyond ecologists and hydrologists, also talk to your MPOs, because those are the guys who are going to be having designs on the waterway itself. We did run into a situation like that up in Rhode Island. It was a pedestrian bridge that we put up there, and basically, they rerouted I-95 and a canal that ran up into Portsmouth. Somewhere in Rhode Island. Long story. Yeah, I have so many cities on the tip of my tongue. But long story short, with the rerouting I-95, it wound up that this waterway no longer became navigable. We still ultimately did have to go ahead and permit the bridge because of the fact that you had gondolas that were running there, taking passengers for hire. So there we have it. Any other questions?
One more question for you, Jim. I think I might know the answer to this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. For the navigation impact reports, are there clear triggers for when those are required, or is that more of like a judgment-based decision by the Coast Guard?
It's a judgment-based decision on the part of the Coast Guard, but there are clear triggers as well. In other words, we're talking about a bridge that you want to go ahead and build a bridge. It may introduce navigation clearances and heretofore never existed on that particular waterway.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to want to go ahead and take a look at that, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, how does this impact waterway navigation? How are we going to go ahead and be able to mitigate that so we can accommodate the reasonable, and that's an important word to remember there, reasonable. It's elastic, reasonable needs of navigation.
Mm-hmm. But that's a decision
that NIR topic is one of the things that I'll be going over
Yeah.
in a bit. So if you could hold
Okay.
on the NIR and PNCD questions for just a little bit longer,
Yep.
I might answer them before you even ask them.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, all right, well, that's my presentation.
Good morning. My name is Jamie Folzen, and I apologize again for not being able to, look you, virtually in the eye. But you know what? Thankfully, we've come to the day and age where we have multiple ways to get into meetings and do what we need to do. So I'm based in Washington, D.C. with Jim, and we're in the Marine Transportation Directorate. And it's our job to advocate for and support maritime commerce. Today, we'll be reviewing the processes involved in completing a navigation impact report, discuss how the Coast Guard conducts a navigation evaluation, and then issues a preliminary navigation clearance determination for a particular project. Jim touched on some of this earlier, but now we'll take a much closer look. For those in the room, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. For those online, please add a question to the chat box. Okay, and if I skip ahead, just bear with us because I am not controlling the slides, but we are a great team. The objectives of this presentation are to identify what the navigation impact report is, what the navigation evaluation is, and what the preliminary navigation clearance determination is, as well as who prepares them. I'll also talk about why these documents are needed, when they are developed during the permitting process, and finally, I'll give more detail on how these documents, particularly the NAV impact report, are developed. So let's begin by first walking through each of the three items. I'll present them in the order that they're completed. First up is that NAV impact report, which is aptly named since it is a document that describes the navigation on the waterway that might be impacted by a proposed bridge project. It's prepared early in the process, ideally shortly after project initiation or the earliest stages of scoping. And since we're an organization who loves their acronyms, beware we may refer to this as the NIR. The Navigation Impact Report is a requirement of the Memorandum of Understanding between the Coast Guard and the U.S. Department of Transportation for DOT-funded projects. It is otherwise highly encouraged for all other projects to facilitate the permit application process. Due to the unique nature of each individual project, the specific format and content of the NIR is at the discretion of the local Coast Guard District Bridge Office. For you, that is our District 7 office based out of Miami, Florida. And I didn't ask earlier, do we have any District 7 reps online or present? I don't think we do.
I don't think so. And are we supposed to be still looking at the presentation objective slide, or oh, there we go, okay.
Yeah, Jamie, I don't think we've got anybody from D7 online right now.
Okay. All right. Well, they're based out of Miami, and hopefully will be very responsive when you reach out to them. They will identify for applicants what required information is to be included in the NAV impact report. The NIR is then prepared by the applicant or their contractor, not the Coast Guard. The general data requirements for this report are listed in Appendix A of the Bridge Permit Application Guide, also affectionately known as the BPAG. Because each bridge project is different, and the Coast Guard may have greater navigational data already available for some waterways compared to others, the data requirements may vary from one project to another. Please note that NIR is the first product that serves to inform the two follow-on items, the Coast Guard Navigation Evaluation and the Preliminary Navigation Clearance Determination. All right, now let's look at the second item, the Navigation Evaluation. For this, the Coast Guard considers the information documented in the NIR, plus any comments related to the project, and then evaluates the traffic, waterway configuration, existing structures, and the proposed project. Is the waterway navigable? Who navigates it, and what are their needs? The evaluation serves as a holistic analysis of the project's impact on waterway users and is conducted to determine what navigation clearances would meet the reasonable needs of navigation. This evaluation is conducted by the local Coast Guard District Bridge Office. The complexity of both project and waterway influence how long the evaluation will take. The evaluation is documented in the Coast Guard's administrative record and is an integral part of the overall permitting process. Finally, part 3. Let's take a look at the preliminary navigation clearance determination, and I dare you to try saying that 5 times fast. Once the District Bridge Office has reviewed the NIR and then completed their navigation evaluation, they create the Preliminary Navigation Clearance Determination, or another acronym, PNCD. The clearance determination will take the shape of a letter issued to the applicant. The purpose of the PNCD is to establish the minimum vertical and horizontal clearances that have the highest likelihood of being permitted by the Coast Guard. These clearances should then be used by the applicant to develop the alternatives for the proposed bridge. The PNCD document is referred to as preliminary because the Coast Guard permit and approved plan sheets serve as the final navigation clearance determination for the project. With that said, let's keep going. So why? Why does the Coast Guard need these 3 items? Overall, it is our goal to smartly determine, document, and share with you how wide and how tall the opening under the bridge should be to support the reasonable needs of navigation, while facilitating other modes of transportation. In other words, we need to document why we're permitting an obstruction to navigation. The NIR documents a variety of waterway characteristics and user information, which we'll cover in greater depth coming up. The NIR, that Nav Impact Report, often provides the bulk of the information considered during the Coast Guard's navigation evaluation. The navigation evaluation is the Coast Guard's formal analysis of the waterway and navigational information. It is documented in the project Coast Guard Administrative Record. The resulting product of the Nav Eval is that preliminary navigation clearance determination. It's the letter that we'll provide to you documenting the minimal clearances that should be incorporated into the design alternatives in order to meet the reasonable needs of navigation. So let's next discuss when these documents are needed in the Coast Guard bridge permitting process. The buzzword is early. At the very start or very early in the process, reach out to your Coast Guard District Bridge Office to let them know of a bridge project's initiation. You'll hear us repeat the refrain early and often. The earlier you advise the Coast Guard of a project, the sooner they will advise you of the permitting requirements, including the need for a Nav Impact Report and what should be included in it. It is advised and ideal to develop the NIR shortly after project initiation. Failure to complete the Nav Impact Report at this time or delaying it until later can lead to costly permit and then project delays. So it's critical that the applicant supply all waterway data needed in a complete NIR in a timely manner. Please note I'll discuss later in this webinar when an NIR is not required. The navigation evaluation and the preliminary navigation clearance determination are completed by the Coast Guard after receipt of the required NIR. This is ideally before or during the NEPA scoping phase. The Nav Impact Report should be completed early so that the Nav Eval and the PNCD can also be completed early. Why early? Well, that's so that the required clearance information is available during or before NEPA scoping to best inform the bridge alternatives to help you determine your design. It's best to know what aspects to design to rather than risking a design that might not be feasible and that we might not be able to permit. Please note that the PNCD has a 3-year shelf life. If a project takes longer than 3 years to get to the permit, reach out to the district bridge officer, your point of contact. Remember, early and often communication can often prevent a world of setbacks. And I know there were a lot of questions already about that timing, that 3-year period. If the bridge project is still in the design phase and it is going longer than 3 years, touch base with the Coast Guard District Bridge Office and they can let you know if they anticipate any big changes or if there is a need to do a reevaluation of that PNCD. It kind of operates similar to NEPA documents. If it is expanded or if you go beyond the time limit, then work with your cooperating agencies to see what needs to be done, if it needs to be reevaluated or redone from scratch. Here's a graphical depiction of developing the NIR, conducting the NAV eval, and issuing the PNCD. Once notified of a project initiation, the Coast Guard relays the project-specific NIR requirements to the applicant. General NAV Impact Report requirements are documented again in Appendix A of the Bridge Permit Application Guide. Next, the applicant or their consultant gathers waterway data in more depth, which they gather waterway data That includes documenting who currently uses or is anticipated to use the waterway, how big are the vessels, how many are there, and a lot more information related to that. We'll discuss data collection in more depth in a few slides. That data is compiled into the NIR. It is helpful, but not required, to provide a draft report to the Coast Guard for feedback. So we're willing to work with you and give you some good information. But again, you have to reach out and ask if we're available. Once the final report is provided to the Coast Guard, the District Bridge Office will complete the navigation evaluation and document the clearances in the PNCD. The preliminary navigation clearance determination will be provided to the applicant for use in developing the project alternative, that bridge design. Now it's time to talk more about when. Excuse me. I'm going to talk more specifically about the navigation impact report, which is that document that the applicant is responsible for completing. As previously mentioned, the District Bridge Office will notify the applicant of what to include in the NIR, if an NIR is needed, and the content is then researched and compiled by the applicant or their consultant. The Coast Guard may be able to help with some data gathering, but the responsibility is on the one seeking the permit. Occasionally, a NAV impact report is not required, but then again, sometimes one is needed. Here are a few examples of when an NIR would more likely than not be required. When an existing bridge is being converted from a movable bridge to a fixed bridge. When there is a proposed reduction of the existing clearances. That is when the proposed bridge will be lower and the opening narrower than the existing bridge. Or when a new bridge is proposed on a waterway and there is no existing bridge at the proposed location. Or at a minimum, there is no existing bridge within this reach of the waterway and the Coast Guard doesn't have good data on vessel usage at that location. It is not uncommon for District Bridge Office to not require an NIR. All right, did you follow me with all those negatives? More clearly, sometimes an NIR is needed for a particular project. The District Bridge Office may already have the required information for a waterway, either from prior bridge permitting projects or other Coast Guard activities. Even if an NIR is not required, the application materials submitted to the Coast Guard must still include information about the waterway's usage. Examples of when an NIR, NAV Impact Report, is not required include when a bridge permit has recently been issued for a project upstream or downstream from the proposed project site, and where that navigation data could be reused for the new project in question. Also, if a proposed bridge is between two existing bridges and all will have similar clearances. And maybe when a proposed bridge is upstream of the last bridge on the waterway, and waterway users do not require higher clearance than the last bridge downstream from the proposed bridge. Again, did you follow me with all of those? Some waterways also have guide clearances established. This list, the guide clearance list, is a set of clearances for various waterways, and it is available on the Bridge Program's website. Some additional examples of when an NIR might not be required include when the proposed bridge is a modification or replacement and will offer similar clearances as the existing bridge, and no changes have occurred on the waterway that warrant further analysis. Or when the proposed project is a removal and replacement of just the superstructure or the road bed, and it has no impact on or actually increases navigational clearances. Please note, only the District Bridge Office determines if previous navigation evaluations are sufficient, current and comprehensive enough to be used for the project. Are there any questions at this point, particularly regarding when an NIR is required? Super. All right. So if it hasn't become evident yet, the NAV Impact Report, when required, is key to project progression and success. We're going to next review required content in greater detail. But due to the number of potential variables we have to look at, we won't be looking at everything. The full list of factors and variables is found in Appendix A of the Bridge Permit Application Guide, found on our website. And to get there, you can use the QR code that Jim will provide later, or just Google Coast Guard Bridge Permit. Remember, the NIR is developed by the applicant, possibly with assistance from the consultant, under Coast Guard guidance. Okay, let's hit the content. The NIR should identify the physical characteristics of the waterway in the vicinity of the project, identify waterway user information, including shoreside facilities, and their navigational requirements. It should describe the types of vessels that use the waterway: commercial, recreational, governmental, big boats, small boats, sailboats, motorboats, rowboats, paddle boats, all the boats using the waterway. It should also describe the frequency of vessel traffic and activity on the waterway at the proposed bridge site. 1 boat, 2 boats, 10 boats, or more. What is it, and how frequently? How many per day, per week, per month, or year? We require that the NIR identify any federal navigation channel information, and we expect discussion on potential impacts on current and prospective upstream commercial activity on the waterway. Is the waterfront being developed to support more maritime commerce or less? Okay, talking about waterway info. Through the NAV Impact Report, we ask for the identification of specific waterway information. This includes describing existing commercial and recreational users and identifying their trip frequencies or transit. It's helpful to include a survey of annual cargo movements when it's available for commercial traffic. Also identify the waterway stages and elevations for inland or tidal areas as appropriate. Tidal data is available from NOAA. The Army Corps of Engineers may be contacted for non-tidal waterway stage information, such as ordinary high water, normal pool elevation, or 2% flow line. For waterway hydrology and flood information that is specific for a specific period of time, such as how often a river hits flood stage, we suggest you visit the National Weather Service website or contact your local National Weather Service office for up-to-date information. You may be asked to research and consider the impacts of ongoing or planned waterway improvement projects. The Coast Guard may assist by engaging industry in the area and/or other federal entities to determine if there are any plans for improvements, such as widening a channel or placement of new docks. If the project is over a federally maintained waterway, the Corps of Engineers will have information and projections on such waterway improvement projects. For non-federally maintained waterways, the applicant should contact cities, councils, local governments, and private facility owners. As a permitting agency for waterway projects, the Army Corps may be aware of some of these non-federal projects. Additionally, conversations with private, local, state, and federal stakeholders may provide an opportune time to discuss any required removal elevations for existing bridge structures. We prefer that previous structures be removed in their entirety, but we also understand that may not be feasible. It is helpful to identify early on the depth to which any old pilings, piers must be removed when conducting a bridge removal as part of a replacement project. Generally speaking, identify impacts to various vessels' abilities to transit a waterway if the proposed bridge is built. Okay, continuing with waterway information. We request a description of the waterway or river layout, geometry, and hydrology. Look at USGS, NOAA, and USACE charts for data. We also ask that you discuss channel or waterway alignment. Is there a channel maintained by the Army Corps? What depth is it maintained to? Consult navigational charts to see if there's an identifiable navigation channel. Much of it played into bridge pier placement and related discussions. Those discussions may need to include Coast Guard and maritime industry, especially those operating the waterway's largest vessels and/or tugs and tows. Often due to local conditions, Vessel operators may favor particular track lines to maximize control of the vessel or water over the rudder. If there is no specific channel identified on the chart, it is still beneficial to talk to mariners to get a sense of their general transit preferences. We ask for a listing of bridges upstream and downstream from a proposed site, including those clearances. Also, note if and what specific guide clearances are already established for the waterway. And as I mentioned, the guide clearances document is found on our website, and it establishes the minimum clearances for proposed bridges along particular waterways. It may be possible for the District Bridge Office to coordinate ride-alongs on Coast Guard Auxiliary, or other local vessels to assist in gathering relevant waterway information. Finally, for complex projects, it may be advisable to run simulations to verify channel alignment and various vessels' ability to safely navigate through proposed clearances. Now let's discuss what we like to see specifically about the waterway users. Common ways to obtain this information is through surveys, interviewing harbor masters and/or port authorities, reviewing drawbridge logs, and visiting marinas. Helpful information to gather includes vessel name and registration or documentation numbers, a description of the vessel type and owner contact info, identification of the primary mooring locations, are they near or far, vessel dimensions, we're talking beam, length, draft, and air draft, identifying if it is a specialized vessel with any restrictions such as limited maneuvering. Think tug and tows, tankers, fish trawlers with outriggers, bulk or container cargoes, ferries, dinner cruises. What is the vessel's horizontal and vertical safety margin? Do or will any vessels require modification to safely transit the bridge? Examples include the need and ability to partially or fully dismantle masts, outriggers, or antennas. When the waterway has an Army Corps structure such as a lock and dam, do consult with that facility to obtain their vessel traffic data. Here's an example of a vessel survey. Pardon that it's a little hard to read, and frankly, I do recognize it's a relic in today's digital age. Anyway, it's a document that asks most of the vessel questions I previously discussed. Engage with the District Bridge Office to obtain a tailorable template and discuss setting up the survey. In addition to the applicant's outreach, the Coast Guard District Bridge Office may be able to assist with survey distribution, either paper or digital, or both. District Bridge Offices may be able to provide applicants with marina or facility contact information for various waterways. You should also research and contact private companies that operate in the vicinity, as well as emergency vessel and maintenance vessel operators. If it's a smaller waterway with little commerce but heavy recreation traffic, send surveys to and post surveys at marinas. That's a good way to gather waterway usage from the rec community. Regarding the proposed site, we benefit from understanding the localized activity. How many and what types of vessels are transiting the area? Are there seasonal differences? If necessary, the Coast Guard can assist with identifying waterborne activities at the bridge site. This is particularly true for vessel traffic service areas. Unfortunately, I don't believe there are any VTSs in Georgia, but we still have waterway offices that can help. Is the existing bridge or other structures in the area prone to marine casualties? Have vessels had issues in the area? The Coast Guard may be able to query internal data systems to provide historical data on marine casualties, including bridge elisions and collisions, rammings, and groundings. We'd also like a description of vessel transit speeds, load configurations, traffic makeup, and annual cargo movements. This is best obtained by engaging with maritime users, facilities, harbor masters, port authorities, marine operators, the Army Corps, harbor safety committees, and the like. The NAV impact report should include channel information, such as identifying if there is a federally authorized navigation channel. It should also note if the channel is maintained by the Army Corps or even local authorities, and if so, to what depth is it maintained. Did the Army Corps use a design vessel when planning the channel? If yes, what was the design vessel and was it reviewed by the Coast Guard? As you may have surmised, the Army Corps of Engineers is a great point of contact for channel and waterway information. The NIR should also discuss relevant economic impacts, such as whether there are any existing or planned industrial developments that will be negatively or positively impacted by proposed clearances. For example, are there local shipyards that service large vessels or sailboats, and will they be able to continue to do so? What is the specific zoning for the land along the shore in the vicinity of the proposed bridge? Please identify future vessel size and traffic trends. Generally, industry is the best source for this information. And as I've mentioned before, we encourage communication with recreational and commercial maritime industry. Not only should you engage early and often with the Coast Guard, but also with the maritime community. Maritime commerce is a big and very lucrative deal now and into the future. And
Jamie,
don't
can I hop in
doubt.
real quick?
Sure.
MPOs are really a good source to talk to about, talking about this slide and specifically. You want to go and reach out to your metropolitan planning organizations because they can give you a wealth of information. Again, we're talking about a lot of potential future development. So those are guys that are well worth talking to. In fact, we're reaching out to AMPO, the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, and we want to go ahead and give them this presentation specifically because we want to go ahead and increase that level of cooperation between the MPOs, the Coast Guard, as well as other permitting agencies.
Yeah.
Pardon my intrusion, Jamie.
No worries. Yeah, and also look for publicly available information, such as through general internet and newspaper report searches. Another way of confirming plans for future waterway development is to seek that input that Jim was talking about from local and state governments, from waterway landowners and stakeholders that you see up and down the waterway or that you learn about from others. And really don't doubt it that industry will contact the Coast Guard when they have an issue or when they want a bridge that allows for greater vessels to go through. All right, so let's now take a closer look at how the Coast Guard can help obtain the information for the NAV impact report. Some of these you may have already heard. We, the Coast Guard, can help coordinate site visits or ride-alongs with qualified vessel operators or possibly on Coast Guard assets or Coast Guard auxiliary assets. We can issue a Coast Guard preliminary public notice to solicit comments specifically on navigational concerns or even just to identify waterway users. We can advertise the bridge project in the Coast Guard local notice to mariners. As previously discussed, we can help identify waterway users and possibly help distribute surveys, such as through public notices and harbor safety committees. We can provide previously completed and related formal Coast Guard waterway studies. The Coast Guard can even hold public meetings to gather comments on the proposed project, though this is usually for more contentious and really large, complex projects. We can also request bridge tender logs for existing movable spans on the waterway. So as you can see, depending on the location and complexity of the project, the NIR can range from simple to very detailed documents. Each project and waterway location are different and have differing requirements. Okay, so pausing here, are there any questions? I think I'm feeling a little bit left out. You guys asked all your questions during Jim's presentation. Man. Okay, well, moving on from the NIR. By now you might be wondering, how does the Coast Guard conduct its navigation evaluation and make that preliminary navigation clearance determination? Well, we'll review the NAV impact report and analyze if the proposed project has the potential to impact identified navigational needs in any way. If there are impacts, we evaluate these impacts, taking into consideration all the factors to determine if the proposed project will meet the reasonable needs of existing and potential future navigation. We'll identify if the proposed bridge completely obstructs the passage of any existing waterway users or access to any waterborne facilities. We'll determine if the proposed bridge establishes a new navigational limiting factor, such as will the bridge be the most restrictive or obstructive structure across the waterway? Or will the bridge or proposed bridge match the navigational clearance of existing structures on the waterway? We'll determine if the proposed bridge will impact present and prospective commercial activity on the waterway to include impacting jobs, economic growth, and development. Also, does it impact existing or planned commercial or industrial development? We'll look at whether the proposed bridge impacts existing facilities on the waterway that are or could be considered critical infrastructure, key resources, or important U.S. industrial capabilities. For example, are these facilities unique or one of only a few types in the area or region? We'll look to see if the proposed bridge impacts the Army Corps' ability to maintain a federal channel. And we determine if the proposed bridge impacts any Coast Guard or other government agencies' vessels' ability to transit the bridge to conduct mission essential functions such as patrols, icebreaking, dredging, etc. All of that analyzing will be done to determine the clearances needed to support the reasonable needs of navigation, and that will be the key information included in the PNCD. Once the preliminary navigation clearance determination is made, it is issued as a written letter to the applicant, and it is considered valid for 3 years, so long as there are no substantial navigation changes on the waterway. The letter will include the preliminary navigation clearance determination clearances, a summary of the justification for the clearances, and that expiration date. And as we discussed based on your really good questions, yes, if the PNCD expires or as it is approaching its expiration, reach out to the district bridge office and talk about that with them. They should be able to determine if a reevaluation is necessary or whether or not there's more information or more changes forthcoming that would warrant changes. The important thing is talk to the district bridge office because, well, time passes, things change, and you never know what new things might be happening on the waterway. Often it takes a lot of time for various projects, but that's why we want to encourage communication. Let's take a minute to discuss obstructions to navigation. As we look at navigation on a waterway, we consider all bridges as obstructions to some extent. Bridges do not have to accommodate all possible existing or prospective navigation on the waterway. It is our job to ensure that the bridge meets the reasonable needs of navigation while facilitating other modes of transportation. But remember, we are the advocate for maritime users. How do we look at potential impacts to navigation when it becomes contentious? Mitigation of navigational impacts occasionally plays a role in the bridge permitting process. It's rare though, because applicants are directed towards incorporating designs that normally meet the needs of navigation. They do not unreasonably burden navigation, or most do not intentionally unreasonably burden navigation. The bridge statutes authorize the Coast Guard to issue permits for bridges, which must accommodate the reasonable needs of navigation, but neither the statutes nor the Coast Guard regulations mention mitigation when somebody feels their needs are not being reasonably met. So when there are cases where someone's needs are not being met, it is the possibility that that impacted person can elect to negotiate with the project sponsor or the applicant. They are free to negotiate with you. If they reach an agreement, if the applicant and the impacted entity reach an agreement, the Coast Guard has no opinion about it, but we will then assume that the particular waterway user will no longer oppose the project. With all that said, the Coast Guard has no legal authority to require a project sponsor or that project applicant to offer any type of mitigation to impacted persons or businesses, but we do have a legal obligation to investigate and fully understand the prospective navigation impacts associated with the project. The Coast Guard will not ask applicants for mitigation or compensation agreements. nor will we tell the applicant or any waterway users that mitigation or compensation will be required. If our evaluations identify potential impacts, we can tell applicants that the project, as proposed, appears to affect navigation to such an extent that we will likely find it to be an unreasonable obstruction to navigation. And if we deem it to be an unreasonable obstruction, we will not be permitting it. So I tried to dance around all of that legal stuff as best as I could. And we're about at the end. So you've survived. We've finally made it. Here are a few of the key takeaways I hope you come away with from this presentation. Early, open, and frequent communications between the applicant, the Coast Guard District Bridge Office, and the navigational community is critical to project success. Start the NIR, that Nav Impact Report, as close to project initiation as possible. The whole process, ending with the preliminary navigation clearance determination, is ideally completed before or during the NEPA scoping process. That is so that the identified clearances are incorporated to the bridge design alternative. If the bridge designs meet or exceed the clearances and the other environmental, cultural, and historical requirements are met, then the project has a high likelihood of being permitted by the Coast Guard. The Navigation Impact Report, Navigation Evaluation, and Preliminary Navigation Clearance Determination all become part of the Coast Guard's administrative record, which supports the decision to render a bridge permit for a proposed project. That's all I have. Last opportunity for questions for this topic.
We could probably turn this into a drinking game every time we say early and continuous communication, take a drink, but.
Yep. Totally. Lemonade though.
But that's definitely the common theme. Talk to us. And like I said, we can nip problems in the bud on the front end. All right, Jamie. Go ahead.
Question, yeah. You mentioned that if it's federally maintained waters, then the U.S. Coast Guard, the Army Corps of Engineers, excuse me, can provide a wealth of information. What if it's not? Who do you coordinate with again?
It's not a federal navigation channel?
Yeah.
Well, generally, you're going to be going ahead and talking to harbor masters. You're going to be talking to users, waterway users. You'll be talking to any businesses along the waterfront. What sort of commercial users use it? They have tug and barge traffic utilizing the waterway. If you're talking about major port authorities.
Visit local marinas. If it's a smaller waterway and it's mostly recreational traffic, visit the local marinas.
Definitely, yeah, Jamie's right. Visit the marinas. Boat owners can be pretty vociferous in their opinions. And, yeah, I kind of learned that one the hard way. So.
James, we have another question from the people out on the web. They want you to, will you repeat the people to interview for vessel information?
Jamie, you want to take that one from your slide?
Let me get up to that. Yeah, there's all kinds of different people to interview. Oh, goodness. I can't find my specific list, but people to interview, it really depends on what the waterway makeup is. Who uses that part of the waterway, right? If it's a waterway that's at the mouth of the Savannah River, you're going to be looking at a much broader cross-section of the maritime community than if you're, 10 miles upriver. So some of the folks are tug and barge operators, marine facilities, they can help you, or port authorities can help you with identifying the different vessels that regularly visit particular waterway areas. Are there moorings for fishing trawlers? Are there container or bulk cargo facilities? What dinner cruises work on the waterway? Are there ferries? So any of those kinds of folks. Visit marinas, distribute the surveys to marinas, port authorities, work with the district Coast Guard Bridge office who may be able to reach out to the local Coast Guard Waterways manager, and the Coast Guard Waterways folks will be able to help additionally identify who is in a particular waterway reach. They often run harbor safety committee meetings, which include like the breadth of waterway users for a particular area. So yeah, really, I don't know that I can provide a comprehensive list. It's best to tailor your list to the waterway that you have in question. And you can do that working with your district bridge office point of contact.
Okay, we have another question. When we pass out surveys to local mariners and constituents, what is the preferred amount of time to have that survey open to receive an adequate amount of information? Also, what would be an example of vessel traffic that would seasonally vary?
So I'm going to do the seasonal answer that part first. So seasonal verifications, I don't know that where you are, that's a big deal, but in like New England or the Great Lakes, there's issues with the recreational community. Well, they just don't operate as much in the cold months because, well, the water's hard. But also, the biggest impacts are to the recreational users. You'll see an uptick during some months. Or there might be different commercial traffic depending on if it's grain season and there's a lot of grain or particular cargoes that need to go out based on growing season. And what was the first question?
She was asked, the first part of the question was, how long would we want to actually have how long would the applicant want to have an actual survey instrument for mariners actually out on the street? I don't believe there are any specific timelines. I think it'd be something that you would regard more as reasonable. And again, concerning the fact that you're talking to mariners, you probably want to build at least a little bit of fudge factor one way or the other, allowing them time to go ahead and provide answers. I'm not saying that you keep it open-ended ad infinitum. You want to have a drop dead date, but you want to build in at least kind of a comfort zone in order to get responses from mariners.
And
for any survey.
To continue on with that, we typically leave our public notices open for 30 days.
There's a hot mic. I don't know if anybody else.
Yeah, there's a hot mic somewhere. Looks to be muted now. Yeah, Jamie's right. When we generate a PN, we give it a shelf life of about 30 days. And again, if the survey instrument, that might be a little bit, again, we're looking for fairly detailed answers. Coordinate with your district bridge office. Get their gut feeling on it. What would they consider to be sufficient? And also, it can't hurt to get eyes on. For the person, if you're using a consultant to go ahead and generate the NIR, but it can't hurt to go ahead and get out there on the waterfront yourself. Take a look at the waterway, see what sort of traffic you're dealing with, and visualize what sort of potential impacts you could be looking at with the new bridge.
Good question.
And Brian, do we have any more questions online?
No more questions online.
More questions online. Hit us. Oh, he said no more. Okay. Got ahead of myself. All right, Jamie, you need a few minutes to rack up the next bring up the next presentation?
Well, Amanda might need to switch over.
Okay, we'll tell you what, we're going to go ahead and take a quick 10 here then. We're going to actually walk you through line by line the bridge permit application, which is a good thing because it should clarify any questions really that you may have on the front end regarding what we're looking for, and it'll also clarify why we're asking for a lot of these items. So, Jamie and Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jim, for that introduction. They're really excited now. Hi, everybody. My name's Amanda.
And I'm Jamie, coming back again.
From the Office of Bridge Programs and Permit Division. The purpose of this presentation is to literally step through the bridge permit application template, which will hopefully allow you to become more familiar with the document, its required content, and ask questions if needed. I'll start with the administrative navigation section.
And after a brief pause, I'll go over the environmental section.
If you could please remember to keep your microphones on mute for those online. Remember, this presentation is being recorded, and if you have any questions in person, raise your hand. Those folks online can go ahead and put their question in the chat, and we'll get to you as soon as we see that and answer any questions you might have. So without further ado, let's get into it. First things first, the application template can be found on the Coast Guard Office of Bridge Programs website. To find the site, you can use the search term Coast Guard Bridge Permit in any browser, or you can use the fancy-dancy QR code that Jim's been throwing around all day. Once you're on this page, scroll down to the BPAG applicant template. BPAG stands for the Bridge Program Application Guide, which is the document that describes the overall bridge permitting process and a good document to read if you're contemplating a bridge permit or if you're already in the permitting process. Clicking on the BPAG applicant template will open a fillable Word file. As a best practice, we recommend you start each permit project with a freshly downloaded template and save this template in a reliable and safe location. Don't forget as you're working your permit documents to save them to avoid losing any information. This is what you'll see when you open the application template. It is the primary means for providing us, the Coast Guard, the information we need to support a Coast Guard bridge permit decision and to confirm compliance with NEPA and other environmental requirements. This document is a Word-based template, and we ask that you simply add to it and do not delete any sections. If there are sections that do not apply to your project, we ask that you mark them non-applicable, or NA. If you delete sections that may turn out to be necessary or you don't provide enough detail for these sections, it could likely result in the need for additional back and forth correspondence, which could delay the permit decision. After filling in the application template, feel free to convert it to a PDF file and then return it to the district office via email, ideally with the associated support documents that are logically named and numbered. If you have support documents that are too large to email, you can always contact the district office for alternative means to submitting the documentation. District offices can coordinate large file transfers via the DoD SAFE or Intel Link SAFE. Please note that it's also okay to submit the filled-in application before receiving all the filed supporting documentation. We understand that some permits, approvals, and consultations, like the water quality cert, permits and biological opinions may take longer to process, but providing the application with most of the information filled in gives the district office the opportunity to begin processing the case. That helps speed things up a little bit. However, note that the application will not be deemed complete until all the necessary documents are received. Once it's deemed complete, we will do our best to finalize the permit decision within 90 days. Okay, just like you might at the start of a bridge project, I've pulled a template from the Bridge Program Permits website and have filled it out with examples for us to view. Each bridge case is unique. There is no one-size-fits-all scenario, which in my opinion makes bridge projects pretty interesting. The sample information here in red, when you fill out this information, it is helpful to use a different colored font, and when filling in the application, more is better in regards to providing detailed information. Moving into the template, we start with the administrative details of the permit. Please be sure to date the application. Like in school, we're looking for answers at the who, what, when, where, and how questions. We will start with the who. Note who the applicant is, including both the organization or agency, plus the lead person's name and contact information. We understand that bridge projects can span years. Just let us know if the point of contact or any other information changes, and we'll add it to that case's administrative record. If there's a consultant working on behalf of the bridge permit applicant, we need their information and a letter electronically preferred that authorizes the consultant to work on behalf of the applicant. To put an X in any of these boxes that you see here, such as number 5, simply double click the box and then select check. Okay, next let's move on to the where and what. We ask for the name of the proposed bridge, the waterway that it crosses over, the mile point of the waterway, and the coordinates at the center of the structure. The latitude and longitude can be in decimal degrees or degrees, minutes, and seconds. So long as the coordinates are accurate, we can cut it and paste it into a mapping program. Please note that WGS 84 datum is the preferred reference coordinate system for latitude and longitude. Now let's talk about the mile point real quick. Generally, the mile point is measured from the mouth of the waterway to the center of the bridge, and it's in statute miles, not nautical miles. Don't hesitate to contact the district bridge office to verify that mile point or ask questions about how to determine it. We also want to document the city or cities the bridge is at, near or between, and the associated counties or parishes and states. Be as specific as possible with these pieces of information. It's critical that the location, name, and mile point be correct and consistent throughout the entire document. Note that we will make sure it aligns with what is in the plan sheet title blocks and on the permit itself, which is the legal document this is all working up to. Detailed information regarding location and mile point is especially important when there are multiple bridges in a row on the same waterway. Up next is a description of the project. So we're asking what is being built, modified, and or demolished. Think like a maritime user or someone in a boat. Detail what is going on over the water. Is it a highway, a railroad, a mixed-use path, pipeline? Is the bridge fixed in place or does it let boats through? If it opens, is it a bastille, a vertical lift, or a swing bridge? Generally speaking, why does the structure need to be built or replaced? And please note if it's a design build project. If the proposed structure is a drawbridge, note what regulation applies to the existing bridge, and if that same regulation transfers to the new bridge. Lastly, on this slide, what is the date of the plan sheets and how many are there? Plan sheets are important because they provide us a visual representation of the bridge's characteristics, and they will accompany the permit, which is valid for the life of the bridge. That is, until it's modified, replaced, or removed. We'll cover in detail plan sheets later on, I think, in the technical sessions tomorrow. Here's a little engineering humor to break up the monotony here. Continuing on with the application, what is the estimated cost of the bridge? We do keep track of the bridge cost for reporting purposes. If it's also available, include the cost of a low-level bridge on the same alignment. That is one bridge that would be a design that clears the high water but may not facilitate maritime traffic. However, if you don't have that low-level bridge estimate, if it's not available, that's okay. The next request is, where do project funds come from? List the applicable local, state, or federal sources. We ask for this because it clues us in on who will be the lead federal agency. The Coast Guard will generally not act as the lead federal agency for the purpose of ensuring its conformity with applicable environmental control laws if another federal agency is funding the project. If there is no federal money being spent, however, then the Coast Guard may step up as the lead federal agency. We cover the basics of the who, what, and where with a bonus of how much. Next, let's talk about the when and ask for the proposed timeline. How long will it take to complete NEPA, initiate and complete construction, and open the bridge to traffic, and remove existing structures? If the project will be broken into different phases, please describe the major components of each phase. In a future session, I think Jim's going to dive deeper into the bridge permitting specific milestones. Oh no, I think Matt's coming in for that. But milestones, and talk a little bit about the federal permitting dashboard. Next up, other federal actions. Here we're looking for a list of the other required agency actions, such as Section 401 water quality certification, if issued by the EPA, species takes, Section 106 adverse impact determinations for the preservation of historic properties, and or Section 404 permits and 408 permissions from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Basically, what other federal actions are required? Now we'll tackle a bit of the legal authority. What Bridge Act governs this project? Typically, for new construction and complete bridge replacements, it will be the General Bridge Act of 1946. For older bridges that are being modified, this may fall under other acts as described in the existing structures permit. If the project involves modifying an existing bridge, say adding a lane or protective system, and you don't have a copy of the existing bridge's permit, please reach out to your district office. Continuing on, if the applicant is not the owner, we do ask for a signed statement from the owner authorizing the removal or modification. If that's not applicable, use NA, and if applicable, please cite the signed statement as an enclosure. For privately owned bridges, we ask for proof of ownership, such as a copy of a deed or easement from the owner. Use NA or cite enclosures, whichever is applicable. International bridges are a bit special in that they fall under the International Bridge Act of 1972 or a special act of Congress. They also require coordination with the Department of State, and we ask that those details be discussed here. All right, next we're going to dive into the proposed structure's characteristics. One of the Coast Guard's multiple missions is facilitating maritime transportation. We in the Office of Bridge Programs do that by ensuring that the bridges are built high enough and wide enough to allow vessels to transit underneath, preventing maritime casualties like the ones you see here. The dimensions we particularly tune into include the vertical and horizontal clearances, the overall length of the bridge, and the out-to-out width of the bridge. The plan sheets provided by the applicant visually depict these dimensions. Coming up, we're going to ask for verbal descriptions of the bridge characteristics. Please provide the dimensions in decimal feet and not in feet and inches. Vertical clearance is measured between low steel or low member elevation and mean or ordinary high water. If there is no high water, such as between locks, then there's generally to normal pool elevation. Note that the horizontal clearances should be measured normal to the axis of the channel, that is perpendicular to the channel. Some bridges, such as the one pictured here, cross the channel at the angle that is not 90 degrees. In that case, the horizontal clearance is perpendicular to the waterway, not in alignment with the skewed bridge. For movable bridges, list the clearances for both the open and the closed position. Some vessels may need an opening and some may not. If a bridge is being replaced or modified, please note if the overall length is the same or what the differences in length will be. Same for the out-to-out width. Will the bridge be narrower or wider? Up next, we ask for the waterway's depth. You can provide the depth at the center of the channel, what vertical datum was used. Typically, that's NAVD 88. Then, how wide is the waterway at the project site? Will the proposed structure have an impact on flood heights and the debris that drifts down the waterway during the flood? Now we move further into the details. Will there be a temporary bridge, that is one crossing the navigational channel that is only there to support construction, demolition, or reroute traffic? Note that there's a difference between a temporary bridge and a temporary work structure or false work. A bridge crosses the navigational channel and a temporary work structure does not. For a temporary work bridge, we ask that the same type of dimensions as for the proposed bridge, including the vertical and horizontal clearances, overall length, and out-to-out width. If a temporary work structure or false work will impede the navigational channel, please enter that here or coming up in the construction methodology, I can't say that word, I'm sorry, methodology section. Wrap up this application section by noting any waterway data requirements that were deemed necessary by the Coast Guard, such as if a navigational impact report was provided, its date and the enclosure number. Speaking of 100-year floods, here's how Jim likes to spend his weekends. The photo on the right is not a permitted bridge over water. It's actually the I-676 highway in Philadelphia after the Hurricane Ida in 2021. Pretty crazy. The second photo is Green Lane Bridge, nearly submerged in the Schuylkill in Philadelphia. Thought those are pretty neat. If there's an existing bridge or one that is being replaced or added onto, fill in those specs next. Start with the name and description. Is it fixed or movable, a highway, rail, or something else? If it's movable like a swing or bastille bridge, note the applicable drawbridge operating regulation, and if the regulation will be retained, amended, or removed. The information will be used to start the regulation transfer or removal process. Then list the latitude and longitude of the center of the existing bridge or bridge to be replaced. Follow that with the vertical and horizontal clearances. Note that the same data must be used for the existing bridge clearances as for the proposed. Depending on the age of the existing bridge and its plan sheets, that may require surveying the old bridge. Then also include the existing bridge's length out to out width and owner. So I think Jim's going to go over this in more detail in the technical sessions when we're asking for vertical clearances and stuff like that on the drawings, but I gave you guys a little depiction, the picture of me up on this bridge, and you can see here the vertical clearance is from low scale to mean high and not all the way up here, which is where I was in this picture. Next up, discuss the proposed construction methodology for the project and if there's any restrictions. When is the construction anticipated to begin? What actions will take place first? When, where will false work be placed, and are there any anticipated or required in-water work restrictions, such as those to put in place to avoid harming fish? Will cofferdams be used, poured concrete? The more detail, the better. Aspects of this information may be reflected in various permit conditions, and it will also provide us with an idea of future notifications that we will provide to the waterway users. After talking about construction and possible restrictions, please discuss how land traffic will be maintained during the construction activity. Will traffic move to a temporary work bridge? Will one direction of traffic be switched over when one half of the proposed bridge has been constructed? Will traffic be detoured to a completely different waterway crossing? We ask this because we often use the bridges open to traffic as a point of reference for other completion activities. For example, a permit condition may state that the applicant has 90 days after the newly constructed bridge opens to traffic to remove the old bridge and clear the waterway of construction activities. And related to permit language, particularly for the removal condition, we need input that discusses the extent of removal of any existing bridges or parts thereof. We prefer to see bridges removed in their entirety so that there's no chance of the foundations becoming a hazard to navigation for transiting vessels. However, we also understand that it's not always feasible. What is important is that the removal elevations are in line with any other applicable permits, certifications, or permissions, such as those issued by the Army Corps of Engineers. The extent of removal established, we will then ask for a description of how that removal will take place. In particular, how will removal impact the navigation channel? Will there need to be temporary closures of the waterway? We ask for the specific details, and necessary notifications will be worked out in the future, but it's good to have an idea of the general extent early in the process. Lastly, what other agencies have jurisdiction over this proposed project? We ask this so that we can better coordinate with these other agencies. Okay, so I know that's pretty dry. It's probably what you all feel like in this picture. I have sympathy. Bear with us, having covered the who, what, when, where, why, and how, brings us to the end of the administrative and navigation section. Before diving into the rest of the application, are there any other questions? All right, Jamie, it's all yours.
Fantastic. I'm back. Here we go. Talking about environment. I'll continue to template and just a brief rundown of how to address the applicable control law.
Hey, Brian, sorry, buddy, you're off mute again.
We have a hot minute.
All right. Yep, that sounds much better. Thank you. First things first is the Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. That's that one ring, the umbrella under which so many other policies are covered. We need to know who's acting as the lead federal agency. This ideally will be settled fairly early in the project coordination process. Depending on funding sources, the lead federal agency could be the Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, the Army Corps of Engineers, or even the Coast Guard. We'll also ask you to list the cooperating agencies. More often than not, particularly when we're dealing with a highway bridge, FHWA will be the lead federal agency, while some of the usual suspects for cooperating agencies will include the Coast Guard, FTA, the Army Corps, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and on down the list. Then, of course, we need to figure out what level of environmental review are we dealing with. Is this project going to require a full-blown environmental impact statement, or are we looking at an environmental assessment? Or maybe it's just a categorical exclusion. Either way, this is the block to note the applicable NEPA documents. If we're looking at an EIS, we'll need the EIS date as well as the date of the record of this decision. For an environmental assessment, we'll also need the date of the finding of no significant impact. So for this example, enclosure 5 is both the EIS, the environmental impact statement, dated February 2017, and the ROD, dated February 30th, 2019. Whether it's an EIS, EA, or CE, we do need and review the environmental documents as well as the other requested enclosures in the admin section. Continuing on, this is a spot where you'll note if the environmental documentation has been modified, reevaluated, or supplemented. If it has, please list the date it was reevaluated and note which enclosure it is. So usually we look for reevaluations when NEPA documents are approaching the 5-year or have exceeded the 5-year mark. All right, and we're going to hit all of the other environmental control topics that we need addressed now. First up is environmental effects abroad. Are we looking at an international bridge that's going to connect the U.S. to either Canada or Mexico? From anywhere in Georgia, that would be one heck of a bridge, so mark it no and move on. Clean Water Act is up next. Once you've received your Section 401 water quality certification, or certificate, this is where you'll note the date of the document as well as its enclosure number. Make especially certain that the water quality certificate covers the entire scope of the bridge project. If it's granted under an Army Corps nationwide permit or even a nationwide regional permit, then include the type of permit as well as the date. This one is vital because the Coast Guard will not consider the application to be complete without a water quality certificate or suitable justification that a water quality certificate is not needed. And if the application is incomplete, then no permit is going to be issued. So who generally provides the water quality certificates for projects in Georgia? Anybody?
State.
The state does? Excellent. Are we looking at a bridge project that's going to be either located in or positioned adjacent to a wetland? Basically, will there be work in the water? If that's the case, then we'll need to know the acreage of wetlands that are going to be permanently impacted. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act also requires a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the discharge of dredge materials or fill into the waters of the U.S., including rivers, streams, and wetlands. Please provide the 404 permit from the Corps and any other enclosures that detail wetlands mitigation. For folks who manage projects along the coastline, those states, including Georgia, are likely to have a coastal zone management plan. For your application to be considered complete, you'll need to secure concurrence from your state coastal zone management agency if the project is going to pose any impact to the coastal zone. Different states may have different agencies in charge of coastal zone management. For example, Texas CZM concurrences are handled by the Texas General Land Office, while Virginia DEQ handles those in Virginia. Jim asked earlier, who is the cognizant agency in Georgia? And doing a quick Google, yep, I saw the same as what you guys talked about, that it's the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, their Coastal Resources Division. So if you have any questions about who to talk to for this or any of the other required environmental control laws, just talk to the district point of contact. Flowing right along into floodplains. This is a spot where you'll note if the bridge project is located in a floodplain. If that's the case, and usually it's pretty likely, then note the enclosure and summarize the flood plan information as well as any correspondence from the local floodplain agency. The example here notes the environmental impact statement as well as the specific page numbers in that document where we can read up on floodplain impacts and mitigation. You can also pull useful information from FEMA's Flood Map Service Center in the form of flood insurance rate maps for a specific area. Wild and scenic rivers compliance is pretty self-explanatory. More often than not, this isn't going to apply, but if your proposed bridge does indeed cross a waterway listed in the National Scenic Rivers Inventory, then this is a spot where you'll note your consultations with the National Park Service and related enclosures. For Georgia, it looks like the only river is the Chattooga River near where Georgia, North, and South Carolina meet, which is well inland, so likely not a concern. But even in these cases, it's a good practice to verify with the Coast Guard Bridge Office, because if it's close to an interstate, an interstate area where multiple states are, then there is the potential for interstate commerce, in which case there might be navigability and the Coast Guard should be involved. If your proposed project is going to connect to a unit of a coastal barrier resource system, here's where you say that and furnish the enclosure that discusses the impacts the proposed bridge would have. I checked the Fish and Wildlife Coastal Barrier Resources System mapper and saw some CBRS units along the coast. If the project is in a CBRS unit, those light green areas in the lower left picture, mark yes and provide the Section 6 exemption as part of the application package, plus any Fish and Wildlife Service correspondence. If it's outside of those light green areas, mark the no box and move on. To find the Fish and Wildlife Services mapping tools, use the search term Coastal Barrier Resources Mapper. If the proposed project involves the conversion of lands or facilities funded by Section 6F, Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, check yes here. Coordination with the National Park Service must be included as an enclosure and note the date of the letter of authorization. And that's usually when you're dealing with parks that are already established. Is the project in a national marine sanctuary, such as the Grays Reef National Marine Sanctuary? Not likely, since it's 19 miles east of Georgia, but if so, coordinate with NOAA regarding compliance with the applicable provisions of the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. You'll need to cite setting coordination as well as the date it occurred. If you use a mapper tool for this or other acts, please include the information or a screenshot. If your bridge project is to be constructed in or around a marine protected area, then the law requires that efforts be undertaken to avoid, to the extent possible, harm to natural and cultural resources protected by that marine protected area. Likely, it seems most bridge projects don't typically extend into MPAs, but if for some reason yours does, then you guessed it, we'll need the consultation included in the permit package for reference purposes. And there is the possibility for projects across the lower reaches of the Savannah and the Altamaha rivers, and pardon my pronunciation of that last one. More often than not, it seems as if the bulk of bridge projects are located either within a critical habitat or may pose impacts to a species protected under the auspices of the Endangered Species Act. The Coast Guard will, of course, seek to ensure compliance with the legislation, and all documentation related to ESA must be enclosed in the permit package. If we're dealing with an informal consultation, then we'll need the correspondence for that consultation with either U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service. We'll also want to see a list noting those species that could be impacted by the project, as well as any related biological assessments, and then biological opinions if they're developed. Do include any formal and informal consultation letters as enclosures showing that this was taken care of. Consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service for compliance with the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act is usually included as part of your Endangered Species Act coordination. This is a spot to note so and reference any included enclosures as well as the dates of consultation as appropriate. For the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, engage with the National Marine Fisheries Service for an essential fish habitat list. Similar to the one above, it is usually covered concurrently with your ESA, your Endangered Species Act coordination. Include the essential fish habitat assessment, as well as all correspondence from the National Marine Fisheries Service as enclosures that we can readily consult when reviewing your application. The Marine Mammal Protection. Yeah.
Jamie, I had a question going back to slides for the Endangered Species Act. So I saw boxes for consultation. If there has been a informal or formal conference, do you guys also want that information?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're looking for documentation to really be able to confirm that consultation and conferences were completed and everybody is happy and everything is okay. If that makes sense.
Hey,
All right.
Jamie, this is Aaron with FHWA. I'll also just make a quick comment that here in Georgia, typically our ESA and EFH consultations are done separately because there's actually two different NIMS offices that we coordinate with. So just a note here in Georgia, typically those are handled separately.
Oh, that's interesting and good to know. Thank you for sharing. Cool.
Yeah, sometimes, like I said in my presentation, sometimes you'll see that they fold EFH right into ESA. So yeah, that's good to know, particularly for Georgia projects. Yeah.
Okay, so back to slide 31. The Marine Mammal Protection Act ensures protection for a wide variety of mammals. National Marine Fisheries Service covers seals, sea lions, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Meanwhile, the Fish and Wildlife Service covers polar bears, Pacific walrus, northern sea otters, and the West Indian manatee. If your bridge project has the potential to impact any marine mammal species, then you need to initiate coordination or follow through with coordination with either NIMS or Fish and Wildlife Service, or perhaps even both. The level of coordination, either formal or informal, will be contingent on the anticipated level of impact. Ultimately, if you're issued an incidental harassment authorization or letter of authorization, you'll need to include all of that documentation as an enclosure to the application, and note so in this section here. When it comes to anticipated impact to migratory bird species, you'll summarize that here. List any enclosures and dates of enclosures, and if a permit is involved, include the correspondence and permit. And sometimes we also see the bird information included with the Endangered Species Act stuff. Okay, we're moving right along. Thanks for sticking there with me. Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Again, this may or may not be applicable depending on where your bridge project may be located. But if there are going to be any impact to either bald or golden eagles, this is where you'll summarize those impacts and note coordination. Generally, most of this information will be noted in the environmental document, so let us know where we can find that information, and also attach any nest surveys along with the dates that they were conducted. Invasive species are a big deal. Does your proposed bridge project pose a potential for the introduction of an invasive species to the local ecosystem? If so, this is a spot where you'll need to discuss those impacts or any prescribed mitigation efforts. Like above, this may be detailed in the environmental document. For example, the document might say something along the lines of, all off-road equipment and vehicles shall be cleaned prior to entering the construction site to remove all soil, seeds, vegetation, and other debris that could contain seeds or reproductive portions of plants. Note and include the enclosures, even if they're just a couple of sentences in the NEPA document. Okay, National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 consultation. You'll likely be talking with state historic preservation officers and possibly tribal historic preservation officers as well, in order to determine the area of potential effect, as well as cataloging any properties within that zone that are either listed or eligible for listing in the National Register for Historic Places. Same with protocols for discovery of archaeological remains. We request copies of the SHPO and TIPO correspondence regarding effect and no effect determinations. If a memorandum of agreement or programmatic agreement is drafted, also include that as an enclosure. Again, the more comprehensive the information you provide, and the faster we can find the information we need, the easier the review process will be. And we also recognize that bridges often have very long lifespans and sometimes might be those entities that are listed on the National Historic Register. which can complicate a permit or project, but we can get through it. So moving on, clean air. Clean air is important to us all, and here we ask about compliance with the Clean Air Act. Is the project in an area of non-attainment or maintenance? Note so. Is the project exempt from a transportation or general conformity analysis? Also note that. If a general conformity applies, list the SIP, that state implementation plan, and date here and provide it as an enclosure. As you can see,
you guys know about the EPA Green Book, right? Worth looking up online. That will go ahead and let you know what criteria of pollutants you've got. You know, it'll let you know if you're in a maintenance zone or. Okay. You guys are. Okay. Okay.
Cool.
All right, keep going, Jen.
Yeah, we asked for a lot of information about the Clean Air Act. And if appropriate, please discuss transportation conformity determinations, as well as the potential for increased emissions of particulate matter, carbon dioxide, and other pollutants. As has been the mantra throughout, include and reference supporting documentation. Environmental justice is an area of increasing importance and visibility. If your bridge project poses any possibility of impacting minority or low-income populations, then you'll need to note so and include as an enclosure the analysis describing the analysis and any proposed mitigations for those impacts. Again, often that is included as part of the NEPA environmental impact statement, the environmental analysis, or even talked about during the through the CE. Okay, the end is in sight. If your proposed bridge project is located near a Superfund site or any sites regulated under CERCLA, which is Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, site where we can find any impact, mitigation, and coordination discussed within the environmental document. Additionally, discuss any EPA or state environmental quality agency that may require monitoring of the project site. And that wraps up our walkthrough of the bridge permit applicant template. Are there any questions?
I actually had a question for you guys. Is Georgia a NEPA assignment state? No. Is there any consideration been given to eventually going that route? Directing the question to you guys. No? Not going to happen? Anybody online got any questions?
I have one question. So a permit, if it's issued, is there a duration associated with the permit? Meaning, you know, like a core permit, there's a time period that you have to do the work within?
Yes. We give you 2 years, and again, this could be negotiated depending on the complexity of the project, but by and large, our boilerplate language states you have 2 years to commence construction, 5 years to complete construction.
All right, so it just goes back to what you were saying earlier. Okay.
Yeah.
And there was one topic that you might have picked up that isn't included in our application as of yet, and we don't ask for impacts from climate change and sea level rise. We are internally working on figuring out how to account for that, but at this point in time, it isn't a requirement to be specifically addressed.
It's becoming a bigger thing. We're dealing with the Corps. FHWA's got a piece of this pie as well for the Cape Cod Canal. Generally by federal law, there has to be a vertical clearance of 135 feet for all vessels transiting through the Cape Cod Canal. FHWA is involved because they're replacing 2 of the highway bridges that are spanning the Cape Cod Canal. At any rate, the Corps has built in sea level rise into their model Don't ask me about the model. I don't know. I'm not a climatologist, so I don't know all the math underlying it. But the bottom line is, for now, they're going to build the bridges to have so offer mariners a 138-foot vertical clearance, based on the presumption that by 2070, it'll be 135 feet. So they're projecting a sea level rise of approximately 3.18 feet between now and 2070. Fun times.
Yep.
We've got a couple of online questions. First one is,
Hit us.
I think the first one goes to Amanda's presentation. Does the estimate include planning, engineering, and design as well in the cost?
Wow, that's a really good question. Jim, you've been with the bridge program longest. What do you think?
I won't say, okay, I'm going to be upfront. I don't know, but I'll get you an answer. Actually, let me make a note of that, because that's actually a really good question. Brian, hit me with that question again. And actually, if you could, let me know who asked it, because, like I said, I'll get back to them directly, but yeah.
The name on the question is from Heather E. That's all she put. And the question again is, does the estimate include planning, engineering, design as well in the cost?
Given some of the cost figures that we've seen for many of the bridges, I think the answer is yes, because we're talking about projects that run in the millions of dollars and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars.
I think, what Jamie says, certainly a good interim answer, and I think it's probably the right answer. Honestly, I personally haven't dug that much into it. I just took it at face value. If somebody said, this is going to cost $5 million, I figured $5 million bucks. So I didn't, worry about how it was apportioned, but we can look that up. But I think Jamie's answer is probably on the money, yes.
Okay, we have another question, comes in anonymously. In Florida, we use state and water district permitting for wetlands and state 404 permits. Would you recommend including those as well in the application?
So
Go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, we just worked a couple of permits, or are in the process of working some permits in Florida, and noticed that the water quality certificate is actually through, or has been agreed to be included or covered through the state's environmental resources permit, which, so long as we can follow the bouncing ball of who has what delegation, we will accept that. Now, I know for 404, that comes from either the Army Corps as an individual permit, through an Army Corps regional permit, or through an Army Corps nationwide permit. But sometimes there can be connections to between the water quality certificate and the 404 permit. So it depends on the state and how the state has that set up. But we definitely look at the documentation to make sure that we have 404 and 401 taken care of. I think it's been a while since we've had a bridge permit for Georgia.
What do you guys have any big bridge projects coming down the pipeline? And somebody's shaking his head, yes. Floor is yours. Let me know.
We do. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about it, but we do.
Talk about it. Come on, we're all friends here.
Well, I mean, there's one that's going to be a design build that they're going to raise 5 feet, and I guess there's questions, would Coast Guard be involved or not? So that's still being vetted through. It's the Talmadge Bridge.
All right. Thomas Bridge, what waterway is that over?
Savannah.
Savannah River? My short answer would be yes, the Coast Guard would be involved, but I would, my default answer is rather than trying to go and figure that out, figure that out on your own, I would immediately start discussions with, our 7th district down in Miami and say, hey, this is coming, this could, even if it's something that's be very hazy right now and very conceptual, I would, pique their curiosity, A, and B, they'll be able to go ahead and give you at least a definitive answer if they need to be involved or not.
Yeah, I second that answer. It's smart if it involves the bridge to touch base with the Coast Guard to see what level of engagement they will need to be. So, but good question.
And I know it's a long and almost looks to be a convoluted the whole bridge permit application there. And I'm going to talk about tomorrow. There are times when you're not going to need that. Okay. And I will cover that tomorrow during one of the final wrap-up presentations. We're going to talk about permit exemptions. There's still a few administrative hoops that you have to jump through, but you're not going to have to go ahead and necessarily worry about filling out this beast. So, but again, we'll hit that tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, I have just one, I think you might have touched on it, but I'll just, for clarification. Let's say the project requires an IP with the Corps. As far as and we have a schedule that we're trying to meet also, would the permit application to the Coast Guard, still be allowed to be submitted that we've started the IP process, it just hasn't been issued? So the application is in, but the permit is forthcoming, let's say.
You're talking about a Coast Guard permit to be forthcoming?
Yeah.
Contingent upon the Corps.
Correct.
Our default position is that our permit is always the last in line to be issued.
But is linear is what you're saying? They can't sort of happen concurrently? That's what I'm asking.
Do you want my off-the-book answer on the book's answer?
Well, it's more of a what if, possibility.
These what ifs can and do happen. We deal with that on a very case-by-case basis. I'm not going to say that it hasn't happened. I'm not going to say whether or not I've been involved in circumstances where that may have happened. But again, it's determined on case. My default answer is always going to be the Coast Guard's permit. The Coast Guard bridge permit will be the last permit. We want to have every other permit lined up before we issue ours. So that's my answer. I'm sticking to it. And if you want to have a couple beers later, we can talk about weird stuff, that I've seen in the program, we can do that. But
to add on to that, though, that doesn't mean that we don't start working on the Coast Guard permit until we get all of the other permits. We do it concurrently to help maximize and minimize the time frame that it takes to get everything done, right? So we are trying to work together with other agencies and make sure that we can do what we can, working both at the same time. Okay?
I just recently, with one of my compatriots in the Corps, wrote our latest Coast Guard Army Corps MOU, and we were addressing permit issuance and reasonable assurance if one permit is issued before the other. And the attorneys just on both sides really had aneurysms. So yeah, that's the official line. The Coast Guard permit shall be last.
And if there aren't any other questions, I have one last plug to put in for our email subscription service. If you go to our public website, at the bottom of the list, you'll see a item where you can sign up, and we send maybe a bulletin out every other month or so. It's a good way to get any traffic from us if we have updated opportunities for training or information sessions, or if we make any updates to our templates, like the application template or the permit job aid, the plan sheet job aid, and whatnot. So I promise we don't spam, and you might not hear from us for a month or so, but the email subscription is a good way to get information in your inbox from us directly.
Actually, I'm overdue for that. I need to crank out a new email here shortly.
Yeah, and they're usually short and sweet and to the point.
Okay, if nobody else has any other questions, we can go ahead and get you guys out of here a little bit early. We'll start again tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Hopefully this is helpful for you guys. I know we're throwing a lot of information at you in a very abbreviated time frame. That's why we try to break it up over the course of 2 days. In Hawaii, they wanted to do it all in 1 day. I'm like, are you guys sure you want this? And they're like, yeah. And I swear to God, they were all like dead in their chairs by the time 3 o'clock rolled around. The jet lag didn't help me either. So, all right, we'll see you guys tomorrow at 9 o'clock then.